Hello, I'm Bill Flanagan, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Alberta. Welcome to International Week. Every year, the University of Alberta hosts a series of speakers and events on pressing global issues and the role that we can play in solving them as global citizens. Now, in its 36th year, International Week is a long-standing tradition at the University of Alberta that has been enjoyed by thousands of students, staff, and faculty. I've been looking forward to the opportunity to experience it myself this year for the first time. For the last 3 years, International Week has been exploring the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and the University of Alberta's commitment to helping the world achieve them. What are the UN's Sustainable Development Goals? The 17 goals are intended to guide local and global efforts to improve health and education, reduce inequality, and encourage the economic growth, with the ultimate objective of achieving a better and more sustainable future for all. Canada signed on to the goals in 2015, and the University of Alberta is committed to doing our part through teaching, learning, research, creative activity, community involvement, and partnerships. One of the goals that I'm most passionate about is Goal 3, good health and well-being. Of course, COVID-19 is top of mind for our global community as we try to work together to address not only the health crisis, but the further inequalities it has created. Throughout the pandemic, I've been reminded of another virus that devastated the global community, the HIV virus. I've actively supported HIV/AIDS research initiatives throughout my career and currently serve as the chair of the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research National Working Group. From this work, I know that by working together, our global efforts can have a global impact. Like all events this week, International Week has moved online, but this has opened up the opportunity to welcome speakers from 4 of our partner universities from around the world: the Aga Khan Museum in East Africa, the Indian Institute of Technology, Aachen University in Germany, and the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Though the focus of International Week is global, we have a lot to learn and apply at the local level. Several alumni, faculty members, and local community leaders are joining us as speakers for the daily Global Goals Talk. I want to thank the City of Edmonton, MacEwan University, University of Alberta's Sustainability Council, and a number of the external community partners for working with our global education program to bring together International Week 2021. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome our guest and keynote speaker, Lizzie O'Shea. Ms. O'Shea is a lawyer, activist, and writer based in Australia. And as a fellow lawyer, I've enjoyed getting to know more about her work. And I'm excited to learn more tonight about how her work advances Sustainable Development Goals 8, 9, and 1, concerning decent work, resilient infrastructure, and ending poverty. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I invite you to join us again for the events through the week. Enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much to President Flanagan for the warm welcome. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to be part of this week, and I'd like to thank, therefore, the Sustainability Council, University of Alberta's International Week, and the City of Edmonton. Looking at the past events that have been held in International Week and the calendar of events into the future, I'm so impressed and really proud to be associated with such a global, dynamic, and forward-thinking event. This generation of people occupies a liminal space in human history. For those who are alive today and of an age to be active participants in society, we are the last generation that can prevent climate catastrophe. We'll also be the first generation to start to experience the consequences of climate change, and these are related. We're coming to know the immense challenges we collectively face and what is at stake if we fail to act. Now, if you're interested in the politics of climate change, the privilege and the peril of living through this particular moment will no doubt be something that you've thought a lot about before. But I want to add another claim into this mix. For many of us, but particularly for those born before 1990, we're also the last generation that can remember what life was like before the internet in its current form. Now, that's significant in my view, because the internet is both the greatest innovation of the 20th century, but also one that is falling far below its potential. The capacity to both see it for what it is, but importantly, for what it could be, is a kind of critical thinking that we are duty-bound to cultivate and carry with us through future generations who will grow up saturated in digital technology. At present, the internet feels like a place in which we're groomed for endless consumption. We're incentivized to spend time on device, where the parameters of public debate are set by unaccountable social media platforms, where those who fall outside these norms are unable to find any common ground or truth and are pushed to extremes. It's a place where governments spend time surveilling us and working out ways to dampen our expectations of them, and they discipline us. And they maintain the status quo, where warfare is optimised, human life is cheap, and where privacy violations are the norm. Digital technology has invaded our physical and psychological spaces, often without our consent and sometimes without our knowledge. It's created billionaires while relegating billions to struggle with insecure and underpaid work. The backbone of the internet is oriented towards commerce rather than human flourishing. The internet organises us in automated ways that too often prove harmful because they exacerbate division. But it is possible to imagine the internet and the web being a very different kind of place. It could be a world of empowerment and liberation, where the myriad problems we classify as climate change are tackled head-on, where supply chains can be optimised to minimise waste and maximise recycling of resources, where efficiency and automation can mean we do less work and have more time to participate in important discussions with our communities and in our society. It would be a world in which connectivity was a right, guaranteed by government, rather than something that was provided in an ad hoc way by privatised infrastructure. Now, as a human rights lawyer, I appreciate the role of standards in setting the agenda for a fairer world, in helping us compare the now to an aspirational future, so we can navigate a path for change. The Sustainable Development Goals are a really good example of this. They provide a framework for understanding both the limitations and the potential of our present moment. Now, as a digital rights activist, my argument is that if we are to meet those challenges, it's essential that we reclaim the power of digital technology for the many rather than for the few. That questions about technology policy should not just be reserved for those with a computer science degree or those who head up a startup, but rather everybody who has a stake in building a sustainable future. So when I say we're the last generation to have a choice, I don't mean to say that this is just a burden. I mean that we have the freedom and the opportunity to address climate change and to take back the power of digital technology. I mean it is an urgent but not impossible task. But the question remains, how do we reclaim the present as the cause of a different future? Now, when we think about that in terms of technology, we're often taught to think of technology as a future echo, a possibility incarnate that drags us inevitably onward. To understand it, there is an instinctive sense that we need to imagine the future and bend society around the path determined by tech. But to understand technology, I would argue rather than looking forward, we need to start looking backward. Too often, technology is presented without context. It's treated as a natural phenomenon or a force of nature, as though the development of technology is inevitable and unstoppable. But technology is made, never found. The history of technology, as the great historian Melvin Kranzberg liked to remind us, is a human history. To help us navigate this moment then, history can be an illuminating guide. Not because it reflects a universal, natural, or inevitable march towards progress, but rather because it can cast a light on ideas and movements from the past that produced our present moment. History is not a story of gradual enlightenment, but a study of the struggle between various social forces for power, and that if we think about who holds power now in society, and we want that to change, we want them to be held accountable, we need to trace back how they took it. And perhaps most importantly, history helps us see that we are inheritors of traditions of resistance, of struggle, of diverse ideas and bold visions. We have a duty to not let them be lost or forgotten, and to not let those who are the victors to claim credit for what we've achieved. So I've always thought it was a cliche to talk about how those who refuse to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. But I think those who ignore history are locked out of the possibility of imagining alternatives. They're denied the inspiration that comes from looking back at movements and thinkers in the past that illustrate how people can organise successfully to hold power accountable. So that's how I think we are best placed to understand technology. Not by understanding bits and bytes, ones and zeros, not by learning to code, but by putting historical context around the development of digital technology. And from there, we can talk about the many ways in which digital technology will either play a role in delivering a more sustainable world or stand in the way. And that is, it will give us a guide for how we can reclaim the present as the cause of a different future. Now, there's many ways, of course, in which technology will overlap with the sustainable development goals. And I wanted to pick 3 broad topics to talk about today in the context of technology and a sustainable future. So the 3 SDGs I wanted to focus on were decent work, building resilient infrastructure and fostering innovation, and ending poverty. All 3 of these topics are not simply political or social or environmental. They're technology topics. And my claim is that by understanding the historical context around how technology intersects with these topics, we can make sure that the greatest innovations of the 20th century are put to work in helping us achieve them as goals. So let's start with decent work. I want you to imagine that you were in England in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution is heralding great advances in production, allowing an economic output that would scarcely have been thought possible just a few generations earlier. These breakthroughs in technology, from the loom to the steam engine to the factory, they've brought about a new age of humanity in which dominance over nature is within reach. Humans were learning that we could transcend our frail existence and shape the world in our image. The development of technology transformed humanity's relationship with the natural world. We've created a world where we could increasingly determine our own destiny. Well, at least that was true for a certain few. The experience of everyday people was very different. The workday had been transformed in a rapid and unprecedented manner, from a routine of labour that was built around natural limitations, such as seasons, weather and daylight. The Industrial Revolution has brought forth the hellish possibility of ceaseless production, of an endless workday, of a 24-hour economy. Industrial machinery, of course, could run continuously, meaning that the limits of production were determined by human exhaustion. The time that work finished was dependent on the physical capacity of the human body. So rather than work being a practice of care and skill, of artisanship and community as a source of self-respect, it was sweat and blood, combined with steam and coal, that powered the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is not to idolise what it was to be a peasant, to look back on agrarian society with rose-tinted glasses, but rather to point out that this change in social relationships brought about by the rapid development of technology was in equal measures exciting and horrifying, that it enriched a certain few and immiserated many. As a result, this was not an age of industrial peace or political calm. As machines were built to do the work traditionally done by humans, humans themselves started to feel more like machines, and this stripping of agency was met with resistance. An anonymous letter was written to the Home Secretary in London in 1812. "Remedy for you is sure destruction without detection," it said. "Prepare for thy departure and recommend the same for thy friends." This threatening letter was signed by the figurative radical leader Ned Ludd, perhaps better known as the emblematic leader of the Luddites. Of course, when we talk about the Luddites today, they're often glibly referenced as being anti-technology or anti-progress, but the truth is that they were directly concerned with the conditions of labour, rather than being some mindless reactionary force to try to turn back time. Their chosen tactic was industrial sabotage in the form of frame breaking, and the frame in this context was the stocking frame or mechanised loom, which stripped work, particularly weaving, of its interest and skill, and it sometimes ripped the fingers and arms off those who were forced to operate it. The apocryphal Ned Ludd, frustrated with his monotonous work, took a hammer to the frame, and in smashing it, he started a movement. And from then on, whenever a frame should be found to be broken, it was always the work of Ned Ludd. Now, the Luddites sought to redefine their relationship with technology in a way that resisted dehumanisation. They objected to machinery that made poor quality products, that put workers at risk, that denied them proper pay. And I would argue there's something very modern about the Luddites, that they're almost a 19th century version of Anonymous with their threatening letters and sabotage tactics. They serve as a reminder how many of our current dilemmas with technology raise themes that have consistently cropped up throughout history. The digital revolution, of course, is similarly presiding over the dehumanisation of labour. Just ask gig workers who deliver your food, who moderate your content, who prepare packages from Amazon. There are a huge number of people who work in these jobs. The Bureau of Labour Statistics in the United States reported that in 2018, the percentage of workers in the US with jobs with no minimum education requirement was 31%, while another 40% were only required to have a high school diploma. These people are routinely forced to work with and be managed by very sophisticated technology, despite being classified largely as unskilled. They also often work in inhumane conditions. Amazon workers talk about rationing painkillers and crying on the job as being a regular occurrence. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos is worth $182 billion. Elon Musk has seen his wealth skyrocket during the pandemic to $185 billion. I should say rising $150 billion since March alone. Meanwhile, workers in his Tesla factory labour in unsafe conditions. Violations and fines in the Tesla factory dwarfed the total for the 10 big US auto plants, including BMW, Ford and GM. Now, there's many more examples of this, but the point I'm making is that never before have working people worked so hard for such a small share of the wealth produced. We often assume technology is about accelerating innovation and progress, but in the hands of a capitalist class, it's become about accelerating exploitation. The call to arms of the Luddites, then, holds resonance a full 2 centuries later, demanding that we think carefully about how technology affects labour. And if we're to meet the objective of the Sustainable Development Goals, decent work for all, we need to redistribute the benefits of automation. We need to stop the digital revolution from optimising the production of billionaires. Now, of course, frame breaking may not be the solution here, although I personally wouldn't rule it out. But the Luddites were in many ways the early part of a much larger connected transverse movement around the globe for shorter working hours. And I think this is the tradition that we need to revive in our present moment. This started as a campaign to reduce the hours worked by children in England. So the Cotton Mills Act, passed in 1819, prohibited children under 9 from working under 16 to 12 hours a day. From here, the campaign for shorter hours for all workers gained traction globally. In 1835, there was a general strike in Philadelphia that won the 10-hour day. A little over a decade later in England, the Factories Act of 1847 mandated a 10-hour day for women and children. Workers in Melbourne, where I am now, actually went on strike in 1854 and won the 8-hour day, and that campaign only increased in popularity. Eventually, May Day came to mark an international call, an annual celebration for the legal protection of the 8-hour day from as early as 1871. Now, the 8-hour day movement was the most successful progressive social movement in human history. It was internationalist in spirit, it attracted support from millions of people across several continents, and it improved the lives of countless people. It wasn't an idea of billionaires or clever industrialists. It was a product of people organising together based on a fundamental conviction that work should be done in conditions of dignity. Now, if we're to think of ourselves as inheritors of that tradition in the context of the digital revolution, what might that look like? I think it would involve supporting organising workers who do essential work, like working in supermarkets, transport and delivering our goods. Such work is often formally classified as unskilled, but it's also clear, especially in the context of a pandemic, that it actually keeps most of us alive. So when Amazon workers go on strike, as they did in Germany last year, we should show our support for them. When Uber drivers demand better conditions and pay, we should back them. When Google workers form a union, not just for coders, but open to all people who do work for the company, we should cheer. We need to revive the spirit of the 8-hour day movement for a livable wage in humane working conditions and use that movement to pressure governments to stand up to billionaires. Because if we do not do this, billionaires will start organising themselves. Off their success in California, for example, sponsoring a legal reform to deny drivers their entitlements, Uber's stated plans are to run similar campaigns for law reform all around the world. Decent work is not part of their plan for scaling up their technology. Meanwhile, Google has sacked contractors that have attempted to unionise before. They're extremely keen to avoid workers having a say in how their technology will be used, as Google workers have been vocal opponents of military applications of the company's technology. Amazon is perhaps the most nakedly ambitious of all, actively hiring industrial spies and union busters to prevent even the whisper of organising among their workers. Amazon's business model depends not on decent work, but on conditions of misery, and they're willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect that. Rather than tech billionaires being visionaries and innovators of the digital revolution, we should see them for what they are, masters of exploitation who are holding us back from achieving a sustainable society through their greed and decadence. History has a role to play then in telling us about how technology can transform work, whether it's in 19th century Europe or 21st century North America. We need to organise across workplaces, across industries, across borders, and demand fairness so that work is not about exploitation, but about producing what is necessary to live in conditions of dignity. Now, I want to turn to another one of the Sustainable Development Goals, in which again I think history can be a useful guide for figuring out how to achieve it. The Sustainable Development Goals call for building resilient infrastructure and fostering innovation. And I want to talk about this in the context of the greatest innovation of the last century, the internet. There's been a trend in recent decades to assume that government investment in infrastructure is inefficient and torpid, that whatever could be done by government could be better done by the private sector. Perhaps this is rendered most profoundly in relation to technology. Key developments in tech are often seen as stories of iconoclasts working in garages, studying billion-dollar companies from dorm rooms, attending boardrooms, meetings in hoodies. Or should I say, bunny hugs. But if we dive a little deeper, the history of the internet backbone tells us something about how these innovations came about. That private innovation and startup dynamism was only really made possible through public investment in digital infrastructure. And this is why I want to talk about the history of the internet backbone. So what do I mean by the internet backbone? Well, instead of thinking about the internet as a place, think for a moment about what it actually looks like in physical form. There are cables that run across the world under the oceans, connecting countries, states, and cities, and these intertubes carry packets along optic fibres every millisecond. And this relies on physical infrastructure to do so. Now, this infrastructure didn't come from nowhere. The pipes and switches that connect us today were originally built with public funds for public use. In the early days of network computing, just after World War II, when supercomputers were first being experimented with, various people and organisations started to see the value of connecting them together. A number of different networks developed over this time, both publicly funded through the US military and commercial equivalents. But the first and most important network was not built by business or government. Appropriately, it was built by a collective. Michigan State University, Wayne State University, and the University of Michigan together conceived of a network as a method for communicating between themselves for research purposes. It turned out they were really good at it. It was called the Merit Network, and it received some initial funding from the Michigan State Legislature in the 1960s. Now, separately, other organisations were contending with the idea that the US needed national infrastructure that could eventually roll out continental-wide access to the internet for everybody. Throughout the early 1980s, the National Science Foundation built connections between 5 funded supercomputer centres and a high-speed backbone that connected over 200 regional and campus networks. Together, this was known as the National Science Foundation Network, the NSFNet, or what's commonly known as the Internet Backbone. Now, eventually, as traffic and users started to increase, the National Science Foundation needed to increase its capacity to maintain the internet backbone, and so it solicited assistance in doing so. In 1987, Merit was up to the task. It won the bid to do this. And indeed, against the prevailing expectations when it comes to university, as compared to, say, private enterprise or military operations, Merit performed exceedingly well. Merit ran the backbone for 7.5 years, and during this time, network traffic increased nearly 1,000-fold. It was up to almost 100 billion packets per month. The number of local internet networks on the backbone grew from a handful in 1988 to 50,000 in 1995, of which 22,000 were non-US networks in places like Canada. The number of countries comprising the internet grew from 3 to 93. This was an astonishing scaling up of spectacular proportions, and it was an achievement that is part of the origin story of the internet as we know it today. But this experiment in public infrastructure ended, and it makes me wonder, why did this project come to an end if it was working so well? And the answer, I can tell you, is politics. The NSFnet, or backbone, emerged at a time when large social investments were increasingly considered politically passé. The neoliberal agenda was gaining force on both sides of the mainstream partisan divide in many countries in the developed world, with a renewed and vigorous faith that the market could deliver better services than lumbering bureaucracies of government or public entities. The government's job, according to this growing consensus among the political class, was to regulate markets only minimally and allow the private sector to flourish, privatising services that were previously considered the purview of public institutions. And this was reflected in the approach that they took to the internet backbone in the United States, although this story is also repeated elsewhere. Now, there'd always been a long-term plan for the network to be commercialised, with the aim that researchers would ultimately piggyback off an expanded commercial internet, but this was never questioned. In fact, it was carried out exactly to plan. Commercial providers sprang up, and over the course of the next decade, the US government supervised the complete privatisation of the internet backbone. The NSFnet was eventually defunded. Now, the outcome of this has been an internet that operates at substandard levels in the continental United States. Despite being the place where the internet all began, the US cannot match other developed nations on speed, coming in 10th on average. Most acutely, speeds in rural areas remain slow, with few firms in the private market competing over connections. The Federal Communications Commission now admits that many Americans still lack access to advanced, high-quality voice, data, graphics, and video offerings, especially in rural areas and on tribal lands. The wholesale privatisation process effectively created an oligarchy. A select few companies were able to consolidate a commercial advantage at the time of privatisation and then create barriers to meaningful competition. Now, this is a story that's unfortunately been repeated elsewhere, including, sadly, in Canada. One feature of the history of the backbone in the US is that there were no meaningful regulations imposed upon the use and the development of this internet infrastructure. And there was no requirement, for example, to service those outside major metropolitan hubs and outside urban areas. In places like Canada, that approach to policymaking has exacerbated the digital divide, particularly for rural citizens. Canada now faces a national connectivity gap, with those in rural areas experiencing slower, less reliable internet than those in urban centres. Connectivity is essentially treated as a privilege rather than a right. Notwithstanding, it's absolutely essential to our lives, something that's only become clearer over the last 12 months. Connectivity, therefore, I think, is far too important to be left to the private sector. Now, further and worse, the fragmentation of the backbone created a situation where large providers could cut deals to manage traffic across the networks. And these are unregulated secret agreements made without accountability. And as a result, newcomers seeking to enter the market do not compete on a level playing field. And the position of established corporations has been effectively consolidated. Companies control how traffic flows through the tubes with no oversight, standards, or performance requirements imposed by the government, and this is an enormous concentration of private power over a critical piece of infrastructure that powers human society. Perhaps I don't need to tell you about this as Canadians. Canada rates as the most expensive place to get on the internet of the G7 countries, pretty much on all metrics. Private providers like to blame the size of the country and the spread of the population, but as an Australian, let me tell you, that is bogus. So why does this happen? Well, telcos raise their prices because they can, because there's limited competition and very few ways to create more of it because of the barriers to entry. The three major commercial telcos sit in the privileged position arrived at through sheer luck, and the outcome is a poorer service for a higher price. There was nothing inevitable about the privatisation of internet infrastructure in places like Canada and the US. There is nothing inevitable or even sensible about neoliberal politics in this context. The decision was ideological rather than a function of technical necessity. Tech bros in Silicon Valley love to talk about the dynamism of the market, but it's clear that not only are there some things that the market cannot do, the things that the market actually does requires significant input from the public purse. So if we do want to build resilient infrastructure and foster innovation, there are current examples we can look to. Local government authorities across the US have begun investing in digital infrastructure themselves, with surprisingly positive results. Community Networks, which is a project of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, has collated data on more than 110 communities in 24 states where, instead of waiting for private providers to lift their game, publicly owned networks have sprung up, offering super fast services 26 times the national median. Chattanooga, Tennessee, of all places, is one such example. An agency owned by the city, the Electric Power Board, has set up its own network with a government grant. The network offers higher speeds than any of its private sector competitors, making Chattanooga the first city in the United States to have a citywide gigabit per second fibre internet network at a reasonable price. As places like Canada start to develop policy that aim to close the connectivity gap, I would argue that they should be looking to these publicly funded examples rather than giving any further free passes to the private sector. The history of the internet backbone shows us that rather than a story of private innovation or market-based motivations, the infrastructure that powers our modern society was a creation of public spending. That means the public has a claim over it. Instead of simply outsourcing everything to private interests, we should remember this history as we aim to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which explicitly call for resilient infrastructure. Governments should socialise the backbone, bring it under collective authority of a democratically accountable body, and allow autonomous local investment programs to deliver fast and efficient connectivity across the globe. Now, in the last part of our conversation today, I wanted to talk about ending poverty in the digital age. Ending poverty, of course, is another one of the Sustainable Development Goals, possibly one of the most critical and morally compelling. And I would say poverty is a technological issue. Now, there's many ways in which that claim takes form. In the digital age, if you're poor, decisions about you by business and governments are much more likely to be made by machines rather than people, as compared to those who are better off. And this function of automated decision-making in poverty is what I want to look at today. What do I mean by that? Well, in our digital spaces, they're increasingly organised around our capacity and our propensity to spend. Private companies that dominate the web have set it up as an apparatus of observational intelligence, which assesses our value through the lens of consumerism. This is what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. Now, the customers of these companies are not users like you and me, but advertisers and businesses who want to get access to users. Now, we all know what it's like to be chased around the web by an ad for shoes that you may have inadvertently clicked on, but these processes are not just harmless or mildly irritating. They can actually be deeply exploitative. Numerous scholars have now mapped out how predatory industries like payday lenders, gambling companies, for-profit education providers engage in programs of extensive manipulation of web users, using algorithms to seek out those who are vulnerable and exploit that vulnerability for profit. It's an automated system of class oppression. And it's also been well documented how companies like Facebook perform a kind of digital redlining, for example, by allowing advertisers to exclude people from seeing particular ads based on race, or how Google allows automated ad categories which can permit companies to target those with affinities for hate speech. Now, when these scandals around automated decision-making are exposed, These companies often blame users for misusing their programs or claim such outcomes were unintended. But these problems are symptomatic of a particular approach to design. Users are treated as a source to be mined for information, and these companies then design algorithms that entrench discrimination into the experience of online life and saturate it with the logic of the market. This is not just a problem in private spaces either. The move towards decision-making by machines rather than people has also influenced the delivery of public services. In her book, Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks argues that this current model of data collection and algorithmic decision-making creates what she calls a digital poorhouse, which serves to control collective resources, police our social behaviour, and criminalise non-compliance. Governments make use of data that they collect from us and then use it to make decisions about services like child welfare monitoring and custody, the provision of food stamps, and things like Medicare. And the result is an expenditure of public resources in ways that do not alleviate poverty and actually cause significant human misery. There's a huge amount of investment politically, or at least we are told, that these processes are neutral, scientific, and reliable, that computers make better decisions about how to allocate public resources than humans do. But the reality is that rather than ameliorating inequality, these algorithms entrench and exacerbate class divide. They aim not to eradicate poverty, but to manage the poor, confining them to a cycle of stigmatisation and entrenched disadvantage. This is a global phenomenon. Most recently, it was explored in a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty. And this report highlighted how technology is being used by governments in various oppressive ways in the digitisation of welfare services all over the world. So in Canada, for example, the government has automated processes used to make decisions about immigration and refugee applications. 1/3 of councils in the UK use algorithmic technology to help determine benefit claims, identity fraud, and manage social services. Governments in India, Kenya, South Africa have set up national identity and welfare schemes that incorporate biometric data like fingerprints and retina scanning that are then used to make decisions about all sorts of aspects of the lives of citizens. But far from being neutral or scientific, the Special Rapporteur describes these transformations as revolutionary and politically driven, in which citizens become even more visible to their governments, but not the other way around. The lack of transparency and accountability suggests that these processes are far from beyond criticism, but the fact is it doesn't even occur to some governments that these outcomes ought to be questioned. Too often, the systems of decision-making that give rise to predatory ads, to racist assumptions, that confine people to the digital poorhouse, these automated decision-making processes are treated as too complex and difficult to regulate. How could we even start to apply rules to such a complex system? Instead, these matters are treated as ones of individual responsibility for the individual to fix, that it's the individual's fault if an algorithm makes a bad decision about them, that if the algorithm goes wrong, it's the user's problem rather than a problem with the system, and it's the user's problem to fix. Now, I would argue that if we are to end poverty in all its forms, that most critical of the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to end this idea of individual responsibility for bad decision-making by machines. We need to regulate these algorithms so that they prioritise fairness and empowerment and don't leave the individual to bear the consequences when they go wrong. The great systems theorist Stafford Beer liked to remind us that the purpose of a system is what it does. When we have a system that serves to entrench poverty and discrimination, the question is, how can we change that purpose? One part of this will be stronger regulation over how companies and governments can collect and use personal information about us, the data that goes into these decision-making systems. We need to end data extractivism as an embedded feature of online life, as a business model that companies rely on. But the other part of this is designing decision-making algorithms in ways that are fair. And to do that, we need to regulate them. And in case you're wondering, yes, I do have an example from history where we've done this before, where we've taken the active decision to regulate developing technology to minimise harm. And I think this can give us an idea of how we might be able to do it again. So, it's hard to imagine these days, But half a century ago, car crashes were generally blamed entirely on the driver, despite cars incorporating very few safety standards into their design. Every crash, every injury, every fatality was deemed to be the responsibility of the person behind the wheel. The automotive industry lobbied extremely hard to disclaim responsibility and liability for the harm caused by their products, and claimed that customers for cars were not interested in purchasing designs that reflected an interest in safety. Now, this attitude was in part a product of the lax regulatory environment. The national regulator was understaffed and underfunded, and as a result, the industry was largely uninterested and unmotivated to spend money on safety. Now, to give you an idea of that, in the 1960s, about $166 was spent on research for every traffic fatality. $166. Now, if we compare that to the aviation industry, the figure spent on each fatality on safety research was $53,000. While car companies were happy to invest then in making cars faster or slicker, when safety features threatened aesthetic design principles, the industry resisted them. Then Ford released the Pinto. In a rush to get this inexpensive car to market ahead of a key competitor, Ford executives made a fateful decision to ignore safety concerns. It was brought to their attention somewhat late in the design process that there was a problem with the car, whereby the fuel tank could easily rupture if bumped from behind. The board was informed that the vehicle would be safer with a plastic buffer inserted between the fuel tank and the bumper bar, at a cost of approximately $1.25 per plastic buffer. But Ford decided against committing to the expense of amending the design and pushed ahead without it. The company calculated the cost-benefit of potential legal liability for injuries and deaths and decided it was far more profitable to proceed without the plastic buffer. And then people started dying in horrible ways. The Pinto on the road would explode in flames even when hit gently from behind, and hundreds, if not thousands of people met an awful death, burnt to a crisp inside their vehicle. Now, thanks to fearless journalism at Mother Jones, the public learnt about this fateful design decision by Ford, and it learnt about the grim cost-benefit analysis that the company undertook, and the public was rightly appalled. This came off the back of work done by consumer advocates and lawyers, people like Ralph Nader, who wrote a whole book on the topic of vehicle design and safety, and many lawsuits that were brought on behalf of victims who suffered injuries and death in Pintos. Now, this advocacy changed the industry. Finally, federal regulators began to act. Finally, the industry relented and started to take these concerns seriously and listen to the experience of those harmed by their product and invest in fixing the problems. Finally, engineers and designers were not beholden to the bottom line and nothing else. They were instead given this time and space to properly account for safety in their work. Now, I think we can apply the same approach to algorithmic design. When journalists and advocates raise concerns about discriminatory algorithms applied in public and private settings, we should be finding ways to regulate such programs to prevent companies and governments from being careless or willfully blind to the oppressive consequences of their algorithms, to force them to bear the consequences of bad design rather than those who've been subjected to it. One of the great opportunities presented by the digital age is to be able to use computers to make decisions at scale that resist discrimination, that allow us to become aware anew of how various forms of oppression take root in social practice and to guide us away from them. But this will require that we actively import principles of fairness and equality into our design processes. We need to give space to allow these considerations to be actively canvassed by engineers and programmers in partnership with the communities that are likely to be affected, rather than giving in to the magnetism of the bottom line and waiting for these problems to be manifest after the fact. And in this way, if we follow these design principles, digital technology can undermine the causes of poverty rather than entrench them. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals call for many things. I've only looked at 3 today: decent work, resilient infrastructure, and ending poverty. There's many other ways in which technology intersects with the other sustainable development goals, and there's many other ways in which history can be a useful guide in helping us chart a path to achieving them. But I wanted to spend the last few minutes with a plea to return to where we started. We have a choice. We occupy a privileged position in history where we have the chance to make the present the cause of a different future. We have an obligation to engage with this task meaningfully because future generations will bear the consequences of our choices. My approach to this current moment as a lawyer and an activist is inspired by Antonio Gramsci to possess a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. So there is no call to be mindlessly utopian about the future of technology. To take a view about it as inevitably serving as a force for good would be a strategic mistake. I'm pessimistic about the current direction that technology is taking because I know intellectually that the structures that govern its development are not oriented towards sustainability. But there are reasons to be optimistic about its potential. Indeed, I am in no doubt that technology will be part of the solution to climate change. It has the capacity to create a world in which the SDGs are realised, so long as we're prepared to fight for this. So no matter which of the SDGs might be most important to you, whether it's about women's empowerment or education or responsible consumption or health, understanding how technology intersects with this goal will be critical to realising it. And I would say never feel as though just because you do not have technical expertise, this somehow renders you unqualified to learn or advocate about these topics from a technological perspective. I would say we're required to do so. In times where our present moment feels particularly challenging, it's important to remind ourselves of stories from the past, to look to those who've dared to take on similar challenges and won, who've defied expectations, and who call to us from the past to help us contend with the future with courage. We are inheritors of the traditions of the global 8-hour-day movement that tilted the world towards an axis of greater equality. We are the inheritors of the internet, an invention of immense human ingenuity, collectivism, and public investment. We are the inheritors of movements that have held powerful governments and companies liable for the harms that they caused. The 21st century will be one of uncertainty and possibly tumult, but we are not rudderless against such bracing weather. We can sail towards a world of decency, sustainability, and human flourishing. We just have to be prepared to organise and fight for it. Thank you.
There we go. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the riveting talk. It was great to see a true professional give a lecture, and I feel sorry for my students every week having to put up with me lecture. That was fantastic, Lizzie. I also want to thank you for giving a great iWeek talk and remind people that we have iWeek talks going on all week long. So please make sure that you check those out and see which other ones are taking place so that you can have more great presentations like this. We are delighted now to be able to open this up for questions. And I'd like to encourage you, if you're able and willing, to turn on your cameras so that Lizzie can see the audience out there. And also, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or we're going to try letting people raise their hands on Zoom. If you click in the chat function, you can see the raise hand feature, and we will try and have some people watching that to make sure that you get a chance to ask your question by using your voice as opposed to just typing it out. So whichever you prefer to do, please do that. I'm just going to start with one question, and then we'll go to those that have appeared in the chat and any hands that are raised. So Lizzie, I'm always I have a real appreciation for both the role of government in these types of things, but also the role of the market, and the power of innovation and competition and all of those factors that really play a role. And Amazon is a really interesting example because in many ways they really are a horrible company, and The way they take advantage of people who sell their products online, and then they basically mimic their products and sell them, or there's so many things, and you mentioned quite a few of them, but yet at the same time, there's a lot of really interesting, innovative things that they've done, or that they've done to push to be increasingly competitive and capture the market. And in some ways, maybe not from Amazon, but all of these things we may see some benefit. How do we balance, the need for competition in markets with the role for government to be involved? And is it a balance?
I think that's a really terrific question. I think it's one of the most important questions that we actually face at this moment, because there's a lot of discussion, particularly around a platform like Amazon, around how you regulate it properly from an antitrust perspective, particularly what you're talking about there. So the capacity to act both as a marketplace and a seller within your own marketplace. Is that an appropriate thing for Amazon to be able to do? And do we need to change the rules, or to change the rules as it applies to Amazon? I think what I think is most important at this moment, in which startup culture is lionised, there are a lot of billionaires who are seen as singularly innovative and contributors to the progress of technology. Jeff Bezos is one, but Elon Musk comes to mind, particularly in this context, as another. I think we also do need to remember, in thinking about the kinds of contributions these individuals make, is that they don't do it in a vacuum. They are using infrastructure to be able to build businesses that has been funded by the public, and whether that's Amazon using roads that are paid for by the public, by taxpayers, or whether it's something like Tesla and SpaceX, which that kind of technological development, particularly in space, comes off the back of enormous subsidies by government, but also huge amounts of research that was funded by the public sector to be able to progress that field of research. So I think we have the balance wrong, because we have too many people who are far too wealthy, who instead choose to structure their companies in ways that are extremely exploitative, that in fact optimize exploitation of the human parts of their businesses, and gain those benefits in the form of enormous profits and enormous personal wealth. So, there's a phrase that's been floating around, particularly since the presidential election in the United States, which talks about how every billionaire is a policy problem. And I do think there's some truth to that we do need to find ways to support innovation and development of technology, particularly, but it can't be at the expense of everyday people's rights and dignity, and it can't be structured in a way that allows billionaires to extract enormous amounts of wealth from everyday people. And I think the thing to remember at this point, in terms of navigating that very difficult line, which I don't profess to have a full answer, and I think it's something that will always have to be negotiated through public discussion and debate. But one of the things we have to remember in terms of thinking about that is that these people don't innovate alone, even though that's a very evocative idea of the digital revolution, that it's, people in bunny hugs, dare I say it again, innovating in garages, that actually they do it in a context in which they're supported by the public and public investment in infrastructure. And that means that we have a collective claim on the things that are produced. And it's not just fair to say that it's an individual pursuit that gives rise to individual gains that ought to be retained by the individual.
Great, thank you. I'll throw in universities as one of those publicly funded things that help create these inventions. Okay, I'm going to read off a couple of questions from the chat. So this is from Kay. Kia ora. Thanks for Lizzie for starting with climate change. In New Zealand, we're working our way through New Zealand Climate Change Commission's advice to our government for our submissions on what more of New Zealand should be doing. I've asked how far and what leadership we should expand the shift to remote work and digital services rather than travel to in-person options. Okay, and here's this question. What does history say about who will lead the shifts needed? Commercial leaders, visionaries, groups of ordinary people, and how do we get to where we need to be?
Yeah, I think that's, again, a really interesting question. I think organised workers have a really important role to play, which is an answer you could probably guess from what I spoke about in my presentation, particularly around developing conditions to work within the respect dignity, I think organised workers have a really important role to play. I think it's really interesting in this present moment that, in fact, organisation in some ways is more easy than ever, but also much more difficult where people are relegated to their homes. It reminds me actually of reading about, peace workers in the 19th century who might take work home and do it from home rather than be part of a factory where, huge amounts of that work was done at different times. And that, in fact, not having everybody in the one spot does present difficulties in terms of organising. So that's a problem that we have to confront and find new ways to work around. But I also think the capacity of technology to be able to organise is incredible. So what comes to mind there is something like the Google walkout, where thousands of workers in a highly sophisticated technology company used the company's own tools to organise a mass walkout across multiple countries and continents to demand that their company take the treatment of women in their workplace particularly seriously, and to not permit senior employees to get away with bad behaviour towards women without consequence. Now, I think it's a really inspiring example of how you can use the technology that exists to be able to organise and demand conditions of dignity for work. But I'm not naive as well, that I think this present moment does present particular difficulties. And one of the things that I really hope is that not only that we approach organised workers and unions and the like, or other kinds of ways in which people organise at work, with an idea that they're not kind of relics of the last century, that they've actually got an important role to play in the 21st century, but also that those institutions look to embrace innovation in how they do their work. And I think that's what I'd really like to see. I mean, I'm a union member and I often advocate for that myself at my workplace. Union work is some of the hardest work I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding. And I think there's lots of ways in which I see how unions can embrace that work better, and in doing so, that there'll be a key driver of conditions of work that are likely to be best respectful of dignity. Now, there's other people that will play a role, and particularly governments, I think, and advocating to governments in an organised fashion is always a better idea than trying to do it alone. And there'll be forward-thinking businesses, of course, and that's great to see and should be encouraged and applauded. But I think if we're thinking about what we could do about this present moment to advance the cause of dignified work, then getting organised is probably the key thing that's within our power to do that will likely have the biggest change on that issue.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Brenda, and you'll be asked to unmute in just a second, Brenda, and then you can ask your question. It just takes a moment.
Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Brenda.
I appreciate your bunny hug comment. I caught that out of the corner of my ear when you said it. You've talked a lot, and there's been discussion about the billionaires who are not doing things well in taking care of the people who actually do the work for them and things like that. But can you think of someone who has done that well, or will we even hear about them because they're doing it so well that they've never gotten to billionaire status or whatever?
That's a really interesting question. There are technology companies that do experiment with different ways of working. I sit on the board of the advisory board of a small kind of collective of technologists in the UK who provide technology services to movements, social movements that exist there, and they do it in a collaborative way, and they're a cooperative. One of the things that I profile in my book, actually, as an alternative to, I guess, growth-centric, profit-driven capitalism, is the form of cooperatives, because I think they have got the potential to be very constructive ways of working, very innovative and agile, able to respond to particular developments in interesting ways, but also give people the opportunity to work in ways that allow them to see themselves in the things that they're producing, and to also work without feeling utterly beholden to the bottom line, and forced into modes of working that are designed to be perhaps efficient and productive without necessarily reflecting their rights as workers to work in ways that they're choosing. And I think the cooperative movement does have a role to play. There's all sorts of ways in which I think, in particularly a tech setting, it might not be a particular company, but there are the roots of that approach to work that you can see in other settings. And if you look at how, the open source software movement, free and open source software movement, I think it's got a lot of problems and it doesn't always work. But I think there are the germs of, in the seed sense, the germs of possibility of alternative ways of working, and looking at how open source communities, for example, work in collaborative ways to develop technology, to share bugs that they find, to share fixes that they've applied. You can see how work becomes this thing that is not just about making money. It's not just about protecting your proprietary interests that might come from your intellectual property. It's about collaborating and kind of working together with others. And there's all sorts of forums in which that happens, something like GitHub and the like, where you can do that kind of work. And it's partly a function as well of some of these tech workers being in positions where they might have the freedom to do that because they're paid better than average, and that gives them time to contribute to those projects. So there's social reasons why that work is able to be done. But my point really is that there's the potential there to see how that kind of way of working might be applied in different settings, and is actually very effective, efficient, produces interesting innovations, but is founded on that idea of collectivism and sharing, rather than what you might normally see in proprietary structures, which is very narrow and closed. So I like to think there's some possible ways of working that could be carried into other settings and organisational ones. I mean, I'm particularly troubled that Microsoft has purchased GitHub, and I'm curious to know what they plan to do with it. So they're very vulnerable, these structures, I think, to being taken over and exploited by large companies that exist in the digital age. But I like to think the kind of philosophy that gets us there in terms of what workers are doing and how they approach their task is a kind of tradition that we could carry forth and find other ways for it to manifest outside of the particular examples that I've given.
Okay, great. So we've got a question from Karsten. Could you speak a bit about the recent exodus from WhatsApp to Signal based upon WhatsApp changing their data safety guidelines?
This is a really interesting issue. So, if you're a user of WhatsApp, you might have seen that the terms have changed. And you probably also know that WhatsApp is a company that's owned by Facebook, but that the merger between these two platforms, or the acquisition of WhatsApp by Facebook, was contentious because there's a question around whether that creates an uncompetitive environment, as they both offer messaging services and platforms of sorts, because WhatsApp is used in different ways around the world. And so there's an argument, it's not entirely clear, that part of the reason why WhatsApp's terms and conditions changed was so that any move to separate out the companies, to reverse the acquisition by Facebook on antitrust grounds, would be more difficult if the companies were greater or integrated to a greater degree. But either way, of course, the terms have changed. Now, WhatsApp was a really interesting app in my view, because they implemented end-to-end encryption early on, as opposed to Facebook, which has taken its time implementing end-to-end encryption on its messaging service. And it's used widely in many countries in the world as partly an alternative to Facebook of sorts, but also just generally as a messaging service. And I think the end-to-end encryption was a strong feature of the app. But I think as the terms of service start to change and people realise that actually their data might be mixed with data that Facebook holds about them, that this company is extremely powerful and influential in the digital age, we're seeing a shift to Signal. And I think there's a lot of people who feel that privacy is important, that they are a bit frustrated with being served with changes to the apps they use on a take it or leave it basis, rather than perhaps being consulted or having the opportunity to make choices that are informed and particular to the particular app that they're using. And I think they get a bit sick of that. And so looking to something like Signal, which pitches itself on the basis of its security credentials as an app that does not collect data about you, that protects the information that travels through space in an encrypted, or makes sure that information is encrypted, I think that selling point is compelling. I think a lot of times when we talk about privacy, there's an assumption that users don't care about it, that people don't think it's important because they give it away all the time. But I think when we give people the opportunity to make choices about it in a meaningful way, rather than just issuing them with terms and conditions, and usually from platforms that have very powerful network effects, you can see that people do actually think these things are important. They don't like how much data companies hold about them. They don't like those data sets being merged when they didn't perhaps expect that when they first signed up to the service. And I think we can see there that there's actually quite widespread concern about the the constant abuse of the right to privacy by these companies without consequence. So I like to think it's evidence of the importance that many people do place on privacy. And privacy, I think, can mean many things in these contexts, whether it's security of the information travelling through space, but it's also mixing of data sets about you personally. And I think we should start to push back on this idea that people don't care about it, or that your privacy is invariably dead, that it's too far gone now in the digital age to resurrect it. That's clearly not true. I think given the chance, people will embrace apps and technology that is more privacy respecting, and that should be a signal to policymakers as well as companies that that's something they should take seriously.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Carly, and Carly's a secondary education student at the University of Alberta, and she's wondering what meaningful impacts teachers could bring to furthering sustainability goals, the sustainability goals that you spoke about this evening.
Teachers, I think they do some of the most important work in the world, and unfortunately undervalued by many of those who hold power in society, but certainly not by me, and I'm sure many people who have had children go through educational systems. They appreciate just how important teachers are, and it's a personal experience as well. So many of my teachers were critically important. What I think teachers can do is encourage critical thinking, particularly about technology, because that's my kind of claim in respect of sustainability, that, critical thinking as applied to tech can help us orient it towards sustainability, orient its development and application towards sustainability. But also, I think, give students encouragement that these debates are not lost, that we have the capacity to change our future, that coming to terms with how we've gotten to our present is pretty critical to that task, I would argue, but that, working on sustainability in your life is probably something that we all have to find ways to do and to fit in around our daily lives and find things to contribute towards building a more sustainable society, but that's not a lost cause, that it's well within our grasp to change the present as the cause of a different future. And so I think teachers have a really important role to play in giving students tools in the forms of critical thinking and an expansive interdisciplinary idea of activism and learning that can put them on that path and encourage them not to accept the world on the terms in which they find it, but to be constantly asking how we might be able to make it better. And I really think that's the role of teachers, to sow those seeds of critical thinking and to give students the confidence that, notwithstanding their youth, that they have a very important role to play in articulating what we need to have from society in order to make it sustainable, and what we expect of people in the present to be able to achieve it, particularly those who hold power.
Okay, great. Erica has a question that says, it sounds like the auto industry had to reach a point of reckoning with the Ford Pinto before it really started prioritizing safety. Do you think the tech industry would have to face a similar reckoning before considering regulation? And if so, what might that reckoning look like?
Well, that's a great question. I absolutely think the moment of reckoning needed to come with the auto industry. I would say that it was able to be forced through activism, journalism, lawyers suing companies who did the wrong thing. Journalists in particular, I think, exposing these stories, putting them in a narrative form that people can understand and feel is accessible. But law, I'm a lawyer, so I'm a bit like a sledgehammer that sees everything as a problem to be smashed in that way, but every problem is a nail. But what I would say is I think lawyers have a role to play in giving platforms to individuals to tell their story about what's happened and why it's wrong, and that, the many people who sued Ford as a result of the Pinto, they were all examples of that. I think the moment of reckoning is sort of underway with the tech industry. I really think there was a moment of reckoning in the wake of the 2016 presidential election in the United States, where Donald Trump was elected, which married closely with the Brexit referendum in the UK, where the potential of social media, particularly to create almost alternative universes that fly below the radar, became apparent, and the difficulties in having a meaningful discussion in which there are shared understandings of what is true became apparent. But also technology companies, particularly somewhere like Facebook, denied that they were responsible for what they might have created in the social sense. And led by workers within those companies, in places like Facebook and Google, but also, of course, everyday people who were pretty upset by how democracy was being hollowed out by some of the practices and decisions within these companies. Really started to make these companies work to achieve their social license and to protect it and to avoid regulation. So in the last few years, well, it's the last 10 years, but I really think it's been the last 4 years predominantly, some of these companies the big tech companies have spent $10 billion on lobbying in Washington, because I think they saw the writing on the wall, and now they're putting themselves in the center of the discussion about how to regulate big tech, which is why I think we're at a particular critical moment. We've got a new president now in the US, the home of many of these companies, who's openly talking about antitrust and has been pushed to that position by activists, by academics, by journalists who've covered the immense problems with how these technology companies operate. And we're starting to look, we've had many different inquiries and investigations, not just in the US, but all around the world by competition regulators and the like, to look into these companies and see how they could be regulated differently. And these companies know that. That's why I think they're organising and spending money in lobbying, and why I think it's absolutely critical that we use this moment actually to organise ourselves and advocate that they not be put at the centre of the process of rewriting the rules, because they are not qualified to do that. They've managed to gain huge amounts by being left unregulated for a long period of time. Now's the time for them to be out of the room and to listen to those who've been harmed by that, those who've got experience in understanding resilient institutions and social democracy, to put forward their view about how we could regulate them so that we build a sustainable society that allows human flourishing. And so I think the moment of reckoning has started, and this is going to be a critical period over the next 5 years in which a lot of these questions will get determined, which is why I'm really keen for more people to get active in this space from all different walks of life, so that we can make a claim that it should, we do need to regulate, we need to have governments do things, but it shouldn't be in the interests of companies who've proven themselves ill-qualified to hold a social license to do what they do. And we need to hear from people who've been harmed so that we can regulate and create laws that best suit them and best empower them to avoid harms in the future.
Okay, I've got a question of my own, and I know there's people waiting with theirs, but I have to follow up on this. So you raised an interesting thing there, and earlier when we were talking, I thought that the importance of antitrust here is really, really big. And even if we go back to people like Adam Smith, it's like, they saw that the risk of monopoly power and that to them, even if they were fighting for free markets, they still felt like antitrust and anti-monopoly laws were critical. But you raise the other sort of power of government here, and that's regulation. So we have the possibility for lawsuits, like what happened with the Ford Pinto. We have antitrust regulation, and then we have the more minutia regulation that digs around and says you should do this, you shouldn't do this. Is it all of the above that we need to balance the power of these companies, or maybe we should just be really hitting hard on antitrust and then let companies that sell privacy as their like Volvo did with safety, maybe we need to do that and just break these companies up so that there's actual competition? Or is it that we actually have to regulate their day-to-day behavior?
Yeah, so I think antitrust is going to be a critical part of it, partly because there are now many people in positions of power in social democracies around the world that do think this is a critical path forward. And there are clear arguments, so what I mentioned before about Amazon being a marketplace, but also a seller in that marketplace, that creates a position of power that can be abused and that needs to be fixed. So there's kind of very traditional ideas in antitrust law that can be applied. There's also outdated rules in antitrust law around consumer welfare, because traditionally antitrust has been framed around what's best for the consumer. In the context of something like Amazon, it's very difficult to see what's terrible for a consumer in having low prices affected by a major monopoly. I think there's other terrible consequences that come from that, but it doesn't necessarily fit exactly with antitrust as it's been traditionally interpreted. So I think there's some old ideas in antitrust that work for the present moment, and some ones that have to be discarded and re-thought through for the purposes of the 21st century. I would say, so while I think there's a huge mandate for that kind of regulatory reform to happen, I think there's other things that will have to go into regulating the business model of big tech in order for us to create a society that does have robust institutions, that has public debate that's constructive, that allows us to, enfranchise people, not just in the traditional voting sense, but also in the context of policy debates. And one of them is privacy. I don't think, often when we think about privacy, we think it's about individualism and being able to protect your own data online. But a huge part of the business model of big tech is to collect vast amounts of data on you. And even if it's not about you personally, it's being able to map you out as a part of a particular community so that they can sell you to advertisers as an audience. And I think if we started to regulate personal information and how it's traded and used by companies properly, firstly, we'd realise how kind of seedy and unpleasant this market is, and how it's full of bad practices. Some of this I've discussed in my book, but the kind of treating people as a set of vulnerabilities to be exploited. But I think also we'd start to see what that market looks like. But I think also we'd start to undermine that business model, which has led to all sorts of negative consequences. So prioritising virality, micro-targeting, the kinds of things that really damage our democracy do often come back to the business model of seeing us as users to be mined for our data rather than users or participants in a society. And so I think privacy regulation is actually much more critical to building a sustainable functional democracy in some ways than antitrust. Or certainly it deserves more attention from critical thinkers. The last thing I'd say about this is I do also think we need to think really carefully about how we invest in moderating these spaces and what kind of resources we need to do it. I've been looking at this, like many people who are following tech debates around content moderation. How do you make that work? In the context of banning someone like Donald Trump from Twitter and Facebook, what does that mean? Who gets to make these decisions? Should it be private companies? Should it be others? And what it really strikes me is that some of these global companies, they have practices that they apply in particular settings, but they may not work. They may not work in other countries, in other communities that have different values. And, some of these principles that are around free speech and the like, they're pretty specific to the community that you're in. And maybe we need to find ways to give more people power to moderate their own content in their own settings in a kind of federated way. So maybe we need to prioritise paying people to be content moderators and being appointed to these roles, being elected to these roles, and having maybe rules around, giving people powers over kind of online environments that we're in that are recognised as being a contribution to society. And I don't know what that necessarily looks like in terms of how you appoint them, how you compensate them, but it's work that needs to be done. And rather than leaving it to a private company to do, or a set of rules that are difficult to enforce or apply, maybe we need to start thinking about how we can create online spaces that are moderated, but according to transparent rules and with people well-resourced to do so. And it sort of makes me think around public broadcasters and comparing something like Facebook to the BBC or the Australian Broadcasting Company here, that you could create online spaces that are publicly funded that allow public debate to occur without the business model that's traditionally been used by big tech to do that, but in ways that are well-resourced and are specific to that local community. So I think that has to be part of it too. Regulation that doesn't just occur coming out of Washington, DC, but actually is kind of specific to the community and the cultural environment that you find yourself in, so that people have greater capacity to kind of influence the contours of some of these debates.
Great, thanks. The banning of Donald Trump was a real discussion item among some of my colleagues and I. And in the end, I think I came up with the notion of, well, in essence, it wasn't that they were right or wrong to ban them. It probably should have been dealt with long before by some other agency that had a democratic structure. And unfortunately, it wasn't. But I need to get on to other people's questions. So Taranjot asks, they didn't understand how data is mined by the government to make decisions on welfare services and other services like that. Can you explain that a little bit more as to how government agencies are using this technology and this information?
Yeah. Absolutely. So there's a great book called Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks that kind of tracks this. It's in a North American. It's in the US mainly that she's looking at this issue. But the Special Rapporteur's report that I mentioned when I was speaking before also gives you some insight into that. But in Eubanks's book, she talks about things like, for example, child welfare services, where when you come into contact with a government department that deals with families or child welfare, if you've got a need to do that because maybe you're reliant on food stamps or some other kind of welfare, you get into the system of the government and they record things about you in a way that if you're middle class or upper class, you're much less likely to experience because you have other sources of support, which means that you largely go under the radar of government. So government then uses often, in the United States at least, proprietary algorithms that analyse the kind of data that they have about people to do things like make preemptive decisions about whether a child should remain in the custody of their parents using predictive models. So you're more likely to have decisions made about you if you've got more data points that have been collected over your life prior to that moment. And she kind of goes through this process. So one issue there is that you might need to make use of welfare services for good reasons. That's a right. You should be able to do that as a matter of right because you're a citizen in society, and we should accept that. But instead, you really treat it as somebody who's given up their rights in order to access that system, and then that can then be used as a way of making decisions against your interest when put into a system of decision making that might not be accountable or transparent in how it's arrived at a particular decision. Now, it's not the case always that you might be automatically have that decision without consequence. It can be just a prompt. So, some of these proprietary algorithms can make suggestions about how decisions should be made, and then it's up to the individual to make them. But they're still very influential. And there's other examples, I suppose, where you might be blocked from continuing to receive a particular payment or other because you've come into contact with the state for something else, whether it's criminal justice or otherwise, or some other kind of family court process. And you can see how the more contact that you've got with the welfare state and the state generally, the more likely you are, I suppose, to be able to be subjected to these kinds of decisions that are unaccountable. And, I think that the Special Rapporteur had a really interesting way of observing how it becomes this machine of surveillance where, you can track how people move throughout various government services and, with the use of biometrics. So, in places like India and other countries as well, they're experimenting with pinning your record to a biometric feature, whether that's a fingerprint or a retina scan and the like. You can see how immensely powerful that could be and how governments could use those kinds of databases for all sorts of purposes without consequence that are, in some of our worst imaginings, but even just to manage people on a day-to-day basis in very oppressive ways. And I think that's really an approach to welfare that we need to junk, this idea that once you start taking any assistance from the state, that you give up your rights, that you're essentially allowed to be subjected to these kinds of decision-making processes, but also treatment by the state that doesn't respect you as an individual, but just sees you as part of a cohort. I think we need to junk that idea and return to the idea that people who use welfare are rights holders and they've got a right to be able to access welfare without necessarily being subjected to surveillance and also systems that are largely unaccountable that serve to entrench poverty rather than alleviate it.
Great. So Alyssa is asking you about developing countries and how developing countries can deal with the connectivity gap, having limited infrastructure while dealing with other issues, poverty, other issues that they're facing, including things like the current pandemic. Do you have any suggestions about how those countries can proceed?
There's a lot of possibility there. I think one thing that comes to mind, actually, I was talking before about investment in the internet and the internet backbone and how governments have traditionally played a role in that kind of investment. One of the things that we are starting to see in the developing world is that instead of government spending money on closing the connectivity gap or building that infrastructure, it's then often being outsourced to private companies to do so. So the example that comes to mind is in India, where Google has a program of providing Wi-Fi in train stations through which many hundreds of thousands of people move on a regular basis. And that Google has set up Wi-Fi services there for free. And the price that people pay, of course, is that their data is collected and used by Google for their own purposes. And I can understand the temptation to accept that kind of bargain from private companies. And I should say it's not just developing countries where this occurs. It's also in, somewhere like New York City. You can walk down the street and you can also access free Wi-Fi at a street level pretty regularly that's run by private companies, including Google. So it's a phenomenon that exists in the developing and the developed world. But I can see particularly the temptation to take that bargain. And I'm very concerned that sets up a paradigm in which public infrastructure is essentially built by private companies without any accountability, without a public process for procurement even, that might be able to set the terms of the particular bargain should governments choose to take it. And I would like to think that that's not the path that we should take. It leaves a question around how you resource it, of course, but I do think it's not acceptable to allow for these projects to be outsourced to private companies to provide that service, just because they're so essential to people's lives, and at the expense of governments investing in them properly. I think governments absolutely have to do this, because I think it's wrong to pitch something like digital investment as somehow opposed to investment in health or other essential services, particularly in this time of crisis, because they do work together, and they are mutually empowering. And in my experience, many governments will often run out of money for public infrastructure projects, but have plenty of money for military and policing applications of their budget. So I think we often are trained to think of the government expenditure as a finite amount when that may not be the true of the possibility that exists there. And I'm very concerned that many major tech companies see the potential in investing in developing countries to build that infrastructure without accountability in circumstances that can have long-lasting effects that are very damaging. So I think that should be one of our priorities, to not permit companies to do that kind of work at the expense of governments.
I think it's following how cigarette companies behaved when they ran away from regulation in industrialized countries to go to developing countries and push addiction in those places. Jonah notes that I'm concerned about how social media addicts users, silos people into ideological bubbles, erodes our attention capacities. Do you have any thoughts about how governments can intervene with these problems, but also how citizens can organize and stand up to essentially, Zuckerberg and others?
Yeah, so I would say, I bleed on about this a lot, but I think privacy is one central way to target this, because if we had better control of how personal information was disseminated, collected, stored, managed online, then we'd have a totally different ecosystem, I think, for something like social media to develop and evolve. So, if companies were prohibited from using personal information except in the best interests of their users, it would completely undermine their business model. And I think it would mean that they would not be incentivized to prioritize time on device over, say, a personally sustainable use of technology. So those things that we hate about social media, the sense that you're sucked in and you can lose hours of your life to it without realizing that things that prioritizes virality, that you fall into filter bubbles and tinier and tinier audiences for specific viewpoints, that you're pulled to extremes because that is a way of keeping people on device. That kind of idea that extremism is an inevitable consequence of spending too much time on social media. It's not an accident. I think that's part of the business model that social media platforms use to keep people on their device. I think if we had better privacy protections that actually prioritise people's well-being and people sense that they were possessors of their information, that they have a right to hold on to it and to not have it be used against them, I think that would be a huge step forward. I think we should also experiment in other forms of social media companies, create the kind of competition that you were talking about before, Bob, because I think if we had more competitors in this marketplace, then you might get environments that prioritise those things above others. And one of the big problems of this particular moment is that there are monopolies, and the network effects have allowed these companies to crush their competitors or purchase them, whatever it may be, but that essentially to avoid more competition. And I think if we saw more competition in the marketplace for social media, we'd get better outcomes in terms of privacy, but we'd also probably get different kinds of environments in which there was less of the kinds of things that we hate currently about social media. The last thing I'd say is, I mean, of course, I understand what you mean when you talk about the difficulties or the bad things about social media. I think there's great things about it as well. There's all sorts of ways in which people connect across boundaries that might not have been possible at all in times gone by. So I think we've got to find ways to cultivate that good bit about it, the facilitation of discussion, the creation of community, and that it's possible to do that without finding ways for it to be a sustainable thing for you personally. And that's important to remember, that in some ways what's so upsetting, I think, about how social media has become so unpleasant is that there's wonderful things about it that need to be considered precious, need to be cultivated. And in my view, the kind of profit model has crushed some of those things or turned them into commodities, and we've had to pay a price for that. So I'd like to think the time is right to kind of experiment with alternatives, to regulate properly personal information, so that the worst excesses of the current platforms are not permitted to continue.
Great. Those who follow me on Twitter know that I get sucked into arguments on Twitter all the time that I shouldn't.
I don't think you're the only one, Bob. Don't worry.
Okay. David asks, how do you see the world reconciling the differences between the cultural differences between China, where data privacy and antitrust is not a high priority, relative to the Western world, especially in the context that 4 of the 7 companies that are leaders in this area are within China?
Yes. So one of the claims that I make in my book is that in some ways, of course, there's huge differences between how China operates and how the United States operates, or the American view of tech companies and the marketplace versus China. But one of the arguments that I try to make, particularly in the context of understanding surveillance in the digital age, is actually those differences aren't as stark as you might first think, because in many ways, these monopolies that exist in the United States do a very similar thing to what happens in China, that large companies control huge amounts of information about you, that's used for all sorts of decisions that might be made about you, of which you have no line of sight, of which there's very little accountability, whether that's credit scores or whether that's a social credit system in somewhere like China. Now, I think there's differences. There's a liberal democracy is different to an autocratic regime, of course. But I think we ought to do a bit of soul searching before we assume that some of the problems that exist in China don't also exist in places like the United States or the Western world generally, that are reliant on American companies for their social interactions or other kinds of participation in public life. So what I would say about that is, I think if we do want to model a different kind of world to a small number of companies and governments owning huge amounts of information, knowing a huge amount about us, we need to start agitating where we are to better return power to individuals to control their experience of online life as a model for what it could look like, and that we've got a lot of work to do in our own backyard before we start criticising China with any kind of legitimacy. So I think there's immense differences, of course, but the commonalities, I think, should give us pause to reflect on how we could build an alternative society that does prioritise human flourishing, privacy, autonomy online, a sense of freedom and a sense of public debate that's based on commonality rather than division. That until we need to start building that world in the part of the world we're in, and that will serve as a model then, I think, to be able to convince others in other parts of the country in other parts of the world who may not see this as a particularly functioning alternative as it is, or may in fact identify that in the US very similar things happen to what happens in China. So I think it's our job to kind of create those alternatives that then can serve as an example outside of our own borders.
Is there a country that does it really well right now? Is there a country that's leading the world in protecting privacy and managing some of these issues?
Well, I mean, I think there's examples like the GDPR in Europe, I think is a good step forward in terms of understanding how you can have rights in the General Data Protection Regulation, how you can have a set of obligations that are imposed upon companies not to use data in a particular way, to give more autonomy and choice and knowledge transparency to users. I think that we need to go further, and I think there's lots of opportunities to do that in different ways. There's different jurisdictions around the world who are experimenting with things like data fiduciaries. So to give you an idea, a fiduciary is a particular relationship you may know, but for example, between a lawyer and a client, or a doctor and a patient, it's a relationship of trust and vulnerability. And there's an argument that you could apply the same in relation to companies that mean that those companies are required to treat information that's given to them with a particular care and respects the vulnerability, the circumstances of vulnerability in which it was given. Now, there's limitations, I think, to that approach as well, but I think experimenting with those things, and there's a proposal, for example, in New York to do that, would be worth trying and seeing how it operated in practice. So I think we've seen some leadership from places like Europe. I think we should start experimenting with different ways of regulating companies and regulating information flows. But I think we've all got a long way to go before we're a model. There's anyone who's a model citizen as yet.
Okay, speaking of countries regulating, Australia, Emma asked this. So Australia is moving, as you know, to have Facebook and Google pay for media content on their platforms, media links. And Emma's wondering what impacts this might have from an ethical, social, and technological regulatory context to users.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. But I'll give you a really brief outline. So what the Australian government is proposing is kind of the first in the world where tech companies would pay for links that are posted on their platform if they come from particular news organisations. And the idea of this regime would be to compensate news organisations for the work that they've done in producing news, particularly in a context where huge amounts of advertising dollars no longer flow to those traditional newsrooms, but instead flow to tech companies. Now, I can understand the motivation for that because I think it's really important that we have properly funded investigative journalism. I'm very troubled by this proposal. Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web, has filed a submission in respect of this particular proposal because he's worried about it as well. And one of the things he says is when he was designing the web, one of its central features was the ability to link freely between websites. That's what makes it work. That's what's kind of underpinned its explosion in popularity around the world over the last 30 years, and that's part of its future. And this brings that into question by forcing payment for linking. And I think that's a pretty important point. I think there's lots of other problems with it in that it tends to favour essentially mainstream media organisations optimising their content in partnership with big tech platforms, perhaps at the expense, again, of users. And so while I could go into it in a great amount of detail, which we probably don't have time for, but what I think is really important is that we find ways to fund journalism, especially journalism where it's been decimated by the digital revolution. So things like specialist beats and regional newsrooms and things like that, which I think absolutely need to be supported. I think we need to find ways to do that without necessarily relying on this kind of system of private transfers. There's an easy alternative, which is to tax big tech companies and then use that centralised revenue to do what we really want to do, which is to restore investigative journalism, to spend money on those gaps that exist in the current media landscape. And I would much prefer to see that kind of approach than these systems of private transfers that favour certain traditional media companies and that entrench a system of data extractivism, of that model of making money from users' data and optimising for search engines using that information about readers. And I'd much prefer that we focus on using centralised systems to target the problems with journalism that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years rather than these kinds of convoluted systems that I think don't necessarily do what they say they'll do.
Great. Yeah, I was wondering that myself, so I'm glad someone asked that question. I also heard that there was your minister, Paul Fletcher, suggested you could just use Bing, which would be maybe perhaps challenging for everyone for a while. But,
well, the other thing you could use, I suppose, is DuckDuckGo, which is obviously a platform that prioritises not collecting data about you. And, maybe that's a good thing, but Google at present is threatening to leave the Australian market for search, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. So we've seen this face-off between lawmakers and Google, I think because they're worried that if this gets up in Australia, it might be implemented in other parts of the world. And yeah, I've written about this a bit. I'll find a link and post it in the chat if I get time. But yeah, it's a very complicated issue, but in some ways it's really simple, because if we're trying to solve the problem of the decimation of journalism, let's do that with public revenue, with government power to do it, rather than assume that kind of tinkering with how the web works at a pretty fundamental level is going to address that problem.
Okay, and we've got one more question here about, in your opinion, what's the biggest action that we can take, educating ourselves and organizing? What are some further references for us to know on this topics? And then they mentioned that you have a book, and I think it would be great if you tell us a little bit about your book and the best way we could go about purchasing it in an ethical fashion.
Oh, wow. That's a good question. So I think if you're looking for the best way to purchase it in an ethical fashion, I would direct you straight to my publisher, Verso, which is the largest radical publisher in the English-speaking world. I think they publish great books, and you can find their website by Googling them. And that way you purchase it directly from the publisher. So I guess to give you a little bit, to take the questions in reverse, to give you a little bit of idea of the book, I try to look at stories from the past, historical social movements, and apply them to debates we have about technology. And my key hope for the book is really to try and build a bridge between two audiences, between a group of people who might have extensive technical background but be a bit new to the world of politics and history, and to be interested in engaging with political and ethical questions around technology, and to try to give them a framework to understand some of those problems. And then on the other side, there might be plenty of people who've thought a lot about politics and activism and history, but perhaps feel ill-qualified to talk about technical aspects of that. And I wanted to give them a grounding in how these technological debates have context and what they look like, and how you might be able to relate that back to political work that you've been involved in previously. And the aim is to build a bridge between those two worlds. So if you feel like you're from one of those spaces, then maybe it's a book for you. But the idea is to look at social movements from the past, thinkers from the past, and argue that we can apply some of those learnings, some of those experiences, and find inspiration really that we can carry into debates about technology today. And I mentioned this in my talk, but I really don't think you need to have a technical qualification in order to comment on technology policy. I think you can learn about it and you can offer something. I think if you've come from a world of activism or politics, or you're interested in these topics from your own particular form of expertise, and that it's actually really important that we have a diversity of voices discussing, coming to terms with, grappling with these very difficult policy problems that arise in a technological context, rather than just thinking it needs to be reserved for computer scientists or people with a particular qualification to opine upon, because I think that's clearly not true. So many questions are technology questions, and even if you feel reluctant to engage in them, I would encourage you to do so, because it's not difficult to learn, but also it's very difficult to avoid. So you won't be able to escape the consequences of technology policy in your particular field of passion or endeavour, I think. So it's very important that we try and inform ourselves. There are plenty of resources, and I think there's a lot of friendly technologists out there who are keen to engage with people from other social movements and the like. And, from that first audience, I suppose I was talking about people who are technologists who are starting to get interested in politics and making the world a better place. And I think what we've really seen in the last 5 years is the radicalisation of tech workers in places like Silicon Valley, but also in other places like India and China and Brazil. There's lots of different groups forming of technologists who are interested in trying to make the world a better place and trying to work with other social movements to do so, and to come to terms with some of these questions around technology policy. So what I would say, I suppose, in terms of resources, there's lots of places you can look, lots of civil society organisations that are focused on these topics, that are outwardly oriented towards including those who might be new to technology policy questions. And I think it's advice that probably holds true for everyone, which is to read widely, to talk to people in different social settings and different social movements that might have encountered these problems, and use that opportunity for cross-fertilisation of movements' ideals and aspirations, but also knowledge and kind of campaigning credentials. So I think there's lots of people out there who want to help you come to terms with it if you're a bit nervous about coming to terms with technology yourself. And I would encourage you to approach these topics with a critical mind and read widely. And I think that's the best basis for making sure we can have great technology policy that serves to build a more sustainable world.
Okay, great. I'll just mention that for those of you who are at the U of A, I'll double check to make sure that Lizzie's book is available in our library, and if it's not, that it will be. Okay, there's one last question here, and we've got time for a quick response to it, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. So this is Kay again. Kay asked the first question from New Zealand, and Kay mentioned a fairly detailed description that, internet has been made widely available in New Zealand through government action, subsidies for low-income households and other aspects like that. What are the barriers to other countries achieving similar levels of availability of internet access? How come other countries aren't doing this, and what are the barriers?
It's probably quite specific to the particular country, I suppose. I think it's probably a matter of political will. I think it is also what I mentioned before. I'm quite concerned about the role of private enterprise that has gained huge amounts of resources through extractive business models that now seek to apply that and to use that to their advantage in particularly developing countries. I do think there's been a lot of leadership, particularly from the UN and the like, and human rights organisations, to argue that connectivity is a right. And I don't think that's glib. I actually think it's true that we need to be able to facilitate access to the internet for everybody on the planet, because it's so central to how we conduct our lives, which kind of goes without saying. But it's given that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in the wake of the Second World War, you can understand why it might be thought of that human rights doesn't have something to say about this, or the UN and its various bodies doesn't have something to say about this. But actually, the UN for a long time in its various capacities has been leading the idea that access to the internet is a human right, and I think that's demonstrably true. So that requires that we build the capacity to do that we ask governments to do it, that to the extent that they may have assistance from other governments, it's done in conditions of autonomy, and these governments are allowed to build infrastructure that isn't controlled by others, that remains in the hands of the public and accountable authorities who manage it. So I'd like to think that it is possible. It's a matter of prioritisation, and it's a matter of keeping private companies out of that debate. And I think it's well within our grasp to achieve that. We should be able to facilitate that. It should be our priority. The question is, how do you politically demand it? And that's why I think that we can look to social movements from the past that perhaps tell us that organising, agitating, working across the spectrum of political debate, working with lawyers, with journalists, with coders, with technologists, will give us the best the best possibility of achieving that by building a really strong social movement that demands it.
Great. So there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat around great bookstores in Edmonton, and there's a few people are asking for your advice of a bookstore in Melbourne that they should going to. So if you have one, throw it out there.
Well, I'm always a big fan of readings in Carlton, which is just near where I live, because it's a beautiful bookstore. There is also other places as well. I'm a big fan of the Trades Hall bookstore in Carlton as well. Trades Hall is one of the oldest and most beautiful buildings in Melbourne. It's owned by the trade union movement. It's full of history, and they have a radical bookshop in the basement that's been going for a really long time. And they also sell my book as well as a selection of other radical literature. And so if you've never been there and you're in Melbourne, I would recommend a visit.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for this talk. It's been fantastic having you. I found it incredibly informative, and there are loads and loads of comments in the chat thanking you for the talk and talking about how great it was. And we'll save that and get you a copy of the chat so that you can read it. I know you have to disconnect soon. Lizzie, I want to thank you again so much. This was fantastic. As I said, I learned a lot and thought it was just tremendously well presented. You crammed a lot of information into the presentation, and then even more into your answers. So I really appreciate it, and I know that everyone else does as well.
If you wouldn't mind, Bob, I did just want to say I'm so grateful for the opportunity to talk. I've had great support from everybody at the University of Alberta in terms of putting this on, and the Sustainability Council and the City of Edmonton. I just want to say as well, I think the audience discussion and questions were wonderful. It's always a joy when you have an engaged audience, so I'm very grateful. This is a great week and I'm so excited to be part of it, and I think everyone's really lucky to have such an amazing array of events on offer. So thank you so much for letting me be part of it.